Things working? Hopefully. Yep. Hey, we will be reading The Lovely Painted Veil by Mr. W. Somerset Maugham. Which entered into the public domain this year. People at the beach there. The painted veil which those who live call life. This story was suggested by the lines of Dante that ran as follows. De quando tu sarai tornarò at mondo e ripostoto della longa via, seguito il terzo spirito al secondo, ricordatemi che son la pia, siena fiffe, dies facemi marena, salsi queltro che nalela pata piara, disposato n'avena con la sua gemma. That was perfect. Perfect reading so far. Pray when you are returned to the world and rested from the long journey, follow the third spirit on the second. Remember me, who I am Pia. Siena made me, Marena unmade me. This he knows who after betrothal expunged me with his ring. Disputed me with his ring. Okay. squeaky chair, everything is set. I was a student in St. Thomas Hospital, and the Easter vacation gave me 6 weeks to myself. With my clothes in a Gladstone bag and £20 in my pocket, I set out. I was 20. I went to Genoa, and Pisa, and then to Florence. Here I took a room in the Via Laura, from the window of which I could see the lovely dome of the cathedral. In the apartment of a widow lady with a daughter, who offered me board and lodging, after a good deal of haggling, for 4 lire a day. I'm afraid that she did not make a very good thing out of it, since my appetite was enormous, and I could devour a mountain of macaroni without inconvenience. She had a vineyard on the Tuscan hills, and my recollection is that the Chianti she got from it was the best I've ever drunk in Italy. Her daughter gave me an Italian lesson every day. She seemed to me then of mature age, but I do not suppose that she was more than 26. She had had trouble. Her betrothed, an officer, had been killed in Abyssinia, and she was consecrated to virginity. No, a death. It was an understood thing that on her mother's death, a buxom, grey-haired, jovial lady, who did not mean to die a day before her dear lord saw fit, Ercilia would enter religion. But she looked forward to this with cheerfulness. She loved a good laugh. We were very gay at luncheon and dinner, but she took her lessons seriously, and when I was stupid or inattentive, raped over me with knuckles with a black ruler. I should have been indignant at being treated like a child if it had not reminded me of the old-fashioned pedagogues I had read of in books, and so made me laugh. I lived laborious days. I started each day by translating a few pages of one of Ibsen's plays, so that I might inquire mastery of technique and ease in writing dialogue. Then, with Ruskin in my hand, I examined the sights of Florence. I admired, according to the instructions, the Tower of Giotto and the bronze doors of Ghiberti. I was properly enthusiastic over the Botticellis in the Uffizi, and I turned the scornful shoulder of extreme youth on what the master disapproved of. After luncheon, my Italian lesson, and then going out once more, I visited the churches and wandered daydreaming along Alerno. When dinner was done, I went out to look for adventure. But such was my innocence, or at least my shyness, I always came home as virtuous as I had gone out. The signora thought she had given me a key, sighed with relief that when she heard me come in, and bolted the door, for she was always afraid I should forget to do this, and I returned to my perusal of the history of the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. I was bitterly conscious that not thus behaved the writers of the Romantic era, though I doubt whether any of them managed to spend 6 weeks in Italy on £20, as I much enjoyed my sober and industrious life. I had already read the Inferno, with the help of the translation, but consciously looking out in the dictionary the words I did not know, for with Ercilia started on the Purgatory. When she came to the passage I have quoted above, she told me that Pia was a gentlewoman of Siena, whose husband, suspecting her of adultery, and afraid of accounting on her family to put her up to death, took her down to the castle in the Maremma of noxious vapours, of which she was confident would do the trick. But she took so long to die that he grew impatient and had her thrown out of the window. I do not know where Ericilia learned all this. The note in my own Dante was far less circumstantial. But the story, from one reason, caught my imagination. I turned it over in my mind, and for many years, for a long time to time, would brood over it for 2 or 3 days. I used to repeat to myself the line, Siena mi fe, discerne mi maremma. But it was one among many subjects that occupied my fancy, and for long periods I forgot it. Of course, I saw it as a modern story, and I could not think of setting in the world of today in which such events might plausibly happen. It was not till I made a good long journey in China that I found this out. I think this was the only novel I have written in which I started from a story rather than a character. It is difficult to explain the relation between character and plot. You can very well think of a character in the void. The moment you think of him in some situation, doing something, so that the character, at least his principal action, seemed to be the result of a simultaneous act of imagination. But in this case, the characters were chosen to fit the story. I gradually evolved. They were constructed from persons I had long known in different circumstances. I had with this book some of the difficulties that are apt to befall an author. I had originally called my hero and heroine Elaine, a common enough name, but it appeared that there were people of that name in Hong Kong. They bought an action, which the proprietors of the magazine in which my novel was serialized settled for £250, and I changed the name to Fane. Then the assistant colonial secretary, thinking himself libated, threatened to institute proceedings. I was offended, since in England we can put a prime minister on stage or use him as a character for a novel, an archbishop of Canterbury or a lord chancellor, and the tenants of these exalted offices do not turn a hair. It seemed to be strange that the temporary occupant of so insignificant a post should think himself aimed at. But, in order to save trouble, I changed Hong Kong to an imaginary colony of Qingyang. The book had already been published when those incident arose and was recalled. A certain number of astute reviewers who had received it did not, on one pretext or another, return their copies. These have now acquired a bibliographical value. I think there are about 60 of them in existence, and are brought by collectors at a high price. Well, I guess we can start the book now. The Painted Veil. I guess chapter 1 or something. She gave me a startled cry. "What's the matter?" he asked. Notwithstanding the darkness of the shuttered windows, he saw her face on a sudden distraught with terror. Someone just tried the door. Well, perhaps it was Amach or one of the boys. They never come in at this time. They know I always sleep under tiffin. Who else could it be? Walter, she whispered, her lips trembling. She pointed to his shoes. He tried to put them on, but his nervousness, for her alarm was affecting him, made him clumsy, and besides, they were on a tight side. With a faint clasp of impatience, she gave him a shoehorn. She slipped into a kimono, and in her bare feet went over her dressing table. Her hair was shined Shingled. Ah. Her hair was shingled, and with a comb she had repaired its disorder before she had laced his second shoe. She handed him his coat. "How shall I go out?" "You'd better wait a bit. I'll look out and see what it's all right." "It can't possibly be Walter. He doesn't leave the laboratory until 5. Who is it then?" They spoke in whispers now. She was quaking. It occurred to him that in an emergency she would lose her head, and on a sudden he felt angry with her. It wasn't safe with the devil that she said it was. She caught her breath and putting her hand on his arm, he followed the direction of her gaze. They stood facing the windows that led out of the veranda. They were shuttered, and shutters were bolted. They saw the white china knob of the handle slowly turn. They had heard no one walk along the veranda. It was terrifying to see the slow, silent motion. A minute passed, and there was no sound. Then, with the ghastliness of the supernatural, in the same stealthy, noiseless, and horrifying manner, they saw the white china knob of the handle at another window turn also. It was so frightening that Kitty, her nerves failing her, opened her mouth to scream, but seeing that she was going to do, she swiftly put his hand over it, and her cry was smoothed by his fingers. Silence. She leaned against him, her knees shaking, and he was afraid she would faint. Frowning, his jaw set, he carried her to the bed and sat her down upon it. She was as white as a sheet. Notwithstanding his tan, his cheeks were pale too. He stood by her side looking with fascinated gaze at the china knob. They did not speak. When she saw that she was crying, "For God's sake, don't do that," he whispered irritably. "If we're in for it, we're in for it. We shall just have to brazen it out." She looked at her handkerchief, and knowing that she wanted to he gave her her bag. "Where's your toupee?" "I left it downstairs." "Oh my God." "I say, you must pull yourself together. It's 100 to 1 it isn't Walter. Why on earth should he come back at this hour? He never does come back at home in the middle of a day, does he?" "Never." "I'll bet you anything you like it was the amach." She gave him the shadow of a smile. His rich, caressing voice reassured her, and she took his hand and affectionately pressed it. He gave her a moment to collect herself. "Look here, we can't stay here forever." He said then, "Do you feel up to going out on the veranda and having a look? I don't think I can stand. Have you any brandy in here?" She shook her head. A frown of an instant darkened his brow. He was growing impatient. He did not quite know what to do. Suddenly, she clutched his hand more tightly. "Suppose he's waiting there." He forced his lips to smile. His voice retained the gentle, persuasive tone, the effect of which he was so fully conscious of. "That's not very likely." He gave a little pluck. "Kitty, have a little pluck, Kitty. How can it possibly be your husband? If he'd come in and seen a strange toupee in the hall, and come upstairs and found your room locked, surely he would have made some sort of a row. It must have been one of the servants. Only a Chinese would turn a handle in that way." She did feel more herself now. It's not very pleasant, even if it was one of the amach. Only the amach. She can be squared if it is necessary. I'll put the fear of God in her. There are not many advantages in being a government official, but you may as well get what you can out of it. He must be right. She stood up and turning to him stretched out her hands. He took her in his arms and kissed her on the lips. It was such a rapture that it was pain. She adored him. He released her and she went to the window. She slid back the bolt and opening the shutter a little looked out. There was not a soul. She slipped on the veranda, looked into her husband's dressing room and then into her own sitting room. Both were empty. She went back to the bedroom and beckoned to him. Nobody. I believe the whole thing was an optical delusion. Not an optical illusion, an optical delusion. Don't laugh, I was terrified. Go into my sitting room and sit down. I'll put my stockings and some shoes. She's cheating on her husband. That isn't nice, is it? No, it is not. But we are at the end of the chapter. What do you think? She's there. Are they going to be caught? Was the husband there? Being all English and stuff? Have a drink and we'll continue. Yep. Also, she's cheating on her husband with a dude with a toupee. Come on, what's up with that? He did as she bade, and in 5 minutes she joined him. He was smoking a cigarette. I say I could have a brandy and soda. Yes, I'll ring. I don't think it would hurt you by looking off things. They waited in silence for the boy to answer. She gave the order. Ring up the laboratory and ask if Walter is there, she said. They won't know your voice. He took the receiver and asked for a number, then inquired whether Dr. Fane was in. He put down the receiver. He hasn't been in since tiffin, he told her. Ask the boy whether he has been here. I daren't. It will look so funny if he has, and I didn't see him. The boy brought the drinks, and Townsend helped himself. Then he offered her some, and she shook her head. What's to be done if it was Walter? She asked. Perhaps he didn't care. Walter? Her voice was incredulous. It always struck me he was rather shy. Some men can't bear scenes, you know. He's got sense enough to know there's nothing to be gained by making a scandal. I don't believe it was for a minute Walter. But even if it was, my impression is that he'll do nothing. I think he'll ignore it. She reflected for a moment. He's awfully in love with me. Well, that's all to be good. You'll get around him. He gave her that charming smile of which she had always found so irresistible. It was a slow smile which started in his clear blue eyes and travelled by perceptible degrees to his shapely mouth. He had a small, white, even teeth. It was a very sensual smile, and it made her heart melt in her body. I don't very much care, she said, with a flash of gaiety. It was worth it. It was my fault. Why did you come? I was amazed to see you. I couldn't resist. You, dear? She leaned a little towards him. Her dark and shining eyes gazed passionately into his, her mouth a little open with desire, and he put his arms around her. She abandoned herself with a sigh of ecstasy to their shelter. You know you can always count on me, he said. I'm happy with you. I wish I could make you as happy as you make me. You are not frightened anymore? I hate water, she answered. He did not quite know what to say to this, so he kissed her. Her face was very soft against his, but he took her wrist, on which was a little gold watch, and looked at the time. Do you know that I must go now? Both? She smiled. He nodded. For one instant she clung to him more closely, but she felt his desire go, and she released him. It's shameful the way you neglect your work. Be off with you. He could never resist the temptation to flirt. You seem in a devil of a hurry to get rid of me, he said lightly. You know that I hate to let you go. Her answer was low and deep and serious. He gave a flattering laugh. Don't worry your pretty head about your mysterious visitor. I'm quite sure it was the Amach. Yes, we are still looking. And if there is any trouble, I guarantee to get you out of it. Have you had a lot of experience? His smile was amused and complacent. No, but I flatter myself that I've got a head screwed on my shoulders. And with that, we end another chapter. Chapterino 3, or I. She went out to the veranda and watched him leave the house. He waved his hand to her. He gave her a little thrill as she looked at him. He was 41, but he had the lithe figure and spring step of a boy. The veranda was in the shadows, and lazy, her heart at ease with satisfied love, she lingered. Her house stood in the pleasant vale, on the side of a hill, for they could not afford to live on the more eligible but expensive mount. But her abstracted gaze scarcely noticed the blue sea and the crowded shipping in the harbour. She could think only of her lover. Of course it was stupid to behave as they had done that afternoon, but if he wanted her, how could she be prudent? He had come 2 or 3 times after tiffin. Then, in the heat of the day, no one thought of starting out, and not even the boys had seen him come and go. It was very difficult at Thing Yen. She hated the Chinese city, and made her nervous to go into the filthy little house off the Victoria Road in which they were in the habit of meeting. It was a curios dealer's, and the Chinese who were sitting about stared at her unpleasantly. She hated the ungratifying smile of the old man who took her to the back of the shop and then up a dark flight of stairs. The room into which he led her was frosty, and large wooden bed against the wall made her shudder. Frowsy. This is dreadfully sordid, isn't it? She said to Charlie at the first time she met him here. Heyo, Mr. Mark Jones. Ingratiating, not ingratitude. I fuck him up sometimes. It's fine. It happens. It's all words. It's work. It happens. Where was I? Oh, yes. Dreadfully sordid. It was till you came in, he answered. Of course, the moment he took her in his arms, she forgot everything. Oh, how hateful it was that she wasn't free, and they both weren't free. She didn't like his wife. Kitty's wandering thoughts dwelt now for a moment on Dorothy Townsend. How unfortunate to be called Dorothy. Terrible name. I dated you. She was 38 at least. But Charlie never spoke of her. Of course, he didn't care for her. She bored him to death. But he was a gentleman. Kitty smiled with affectionate irony. It was just like him. Silly old thing. He might be unfaithful to her, but he would never allow a word in disparagement of her to cross his lips. She was a tallish woman, taller than Kitty, neither stout nor thin, with a good deal of pale brown hair. She could never been pretty with anything but the prettiness of youth. Ugh. Her features were good enough without being remarkable, and her blue eyes were cold. She had a skin you would never look at twice, and no color in her cheeks. And she dressed like what she was, the wife of the Assistant Colonial Secretary of Tianyan. Kitty smiled and gave her shoulders a faint shrug. Of course, no one could deny that Dorothy Townsend had a pleasant voice. She was a wonderful mother. Charlie always said that of her, and that she had what Kitty's mother called gentlewoman, But Kitty did not like her. She did not like her casual manner, and the politeness with which she treated you when you went there, to tea or dinner, was exasperating because you could not but feel how little interest she took in you. The fact was, Kitty supposed, that she cared for nothing but her children. There were 2 boys at school in England, and another boy of 6 whom she was going to take home next year. Her face was a mask. She smiled, and in her pleasant, well-mannered way, said the things that were expected of her, but for all her cordiality held you at a distance. She had a few intimate friends in the colony, and they greatly admired her. Kitty wondered whether Mr. Townsend thought her a little common. She flushed. After all, there was no reason for her to put on airs. It was true that her father had been a colonial governor, and of course it was very grand while it lasted. Everyone stood up when they entered the room, and men took off their hats to you as you passed in your car. But what could be more insignificant than a colonial governor when he had retired? Dorothy Townsend's father lived on a pension in a small house at Earl's Court. Kitty's mother would think it a dreadful bore if she asked her to call. Kitty's father, Bernard Garston, was a KC, Kentucky Fried Chicken dude, and there was no reason why he should not be made a judge one of these days. Anyhow, they lived in South Kensington. He was a KC. That makes all the sense in the world. We end another chapter here. It's not a KFC though. If you would have been a KFC, that would have worked better. Okay, let's see how the hell should this be spelled. No, I didn't hear it. Ah, poop. I think I broke the thing. It was probably in the chat there. And the thing. Let me see.
Qingyan.
Qingyan. Yeah. Okay. Qingyan. Kitty, coming to Qingyan on her marriage, had found it hard to reconcile herself to the fact that her social position was determined by her husband's occupation. Of course, everyone had been very kind, and for 2 or 3 months they had gone out to parties almost every night. When they dined at the government house, the governor took her in as a bride. The government took her. But she had understood quickly that, as the wife of the government bacteriologist, she was of no particular consequence. It made her angry. "It is too absurd," she told her husband. "Why, there's hardly anyone there that one would bother about for 5 minutes at home. Mother wouldn't dream of asking any of them to dine at our house." "You mustn't let it worry you," he answered. "It doesn't really matter, you know." "Of course it doesn't matter. It only shows how stupid they are. But it is rather funny when you think of all the people who used to come to our house at home. That here we should be treated like dirt. For a social standpoint, the man of science doesn't exist," he smiled. He knew that now, but she had not known it when she married him. "I don't know what exactly amuses me to be taken in to a dinner by the sergeant of the P and the O," she said, laughing in order that she said might not be snobbish. Perhaps he saw the reproach behind her lightness of manner, for he took her hand and shyly pressed it. "I'm awfully sorry, Kitty dear, but don't let it vex you." "Oh, I'm not going to let it do that." Chapter 5 Arena. V for Vendetta. It couldn't have been Walter that afternoon. It must have been one of the servants, and after the all didn't matter. Chinese servants knew everything anyway, but they held their tongues. Her heart beat a little faster as she remembered the way in which the white china knob slowly turned. They mustn't take risks like that again. It was better to go to the curio shop. No one who saw her go in would think anything of it, and they were absolutely safe there. The owner of the shop knew who Charlie was, and he was not such a fool as to put up the back of the assistant colonial secretary. What did anything matter really but that Charlie loved her? She turned away from the veranda and went back in her living room. She threw herself down on the sofa and stretched out her hands to a cigarette. Her eye caught the sight of a note lying on the top of a book. She opened it. It was written in pencil. "Dear Kitty, here is the book you wanted. I was just going to send it when I met Dr. Fane, and he said that he'd bring it in. We had a little disconnection there. Should be back. Back in black. Wonder how. How long the disconnection went. Hopefully not long, not too long. Seems to be working now. Don't know exactly what happened, but something happened. Okay. She rang the bell, and then the boy came, asked him who had brought the book and when. Master, bring it, missy, after tiffin, he answered. Then it had been Walter. She rang up the colonial secretary's office at once and asked for Charlie. She told him that she had just learned. There was a pause before he answered. What should I do? She asked. I'm in the middle of an important consultation. I'm afraid I cannot talk to you now. My advice to you is to sit tight. She put down the receiver. She understood that he was not alone, and she was impatient with his business. She sat down again at a desk and, resting her face in her hands, sought to think out the situation. Of course, Walter might merely have thought she was sleeping. There was no reason why she should not lock herself in. She tried to remember if they had been talking. Certainly they had not been talking aloud, and there was the hat. It was maddening of Charlie to have left it downstairs, but it was no use blaming him for that. It was natural enough, and there was nothing to tell that Walter had noticed it. He was probably in a hurry and had just left the book and the note on his way to some appointment connected to his work. The strange thing was that he should have tried the door and then the two windows, if he thought she was asleep. It was unlike him to disturb her. What a fool she had been. She shook herself a little, and again she felt that sweet pain in her heart, which she always felt when she thought of Charlie. It had been worth it. Cool. He had said that he would stand by her, and if the worst came to the worst, well, let Walter kick up a row if he chose. She had Charlie. What did she care? Perhaps it would be the best thing for him to do now. To know. She had never cared for Walter, and since she had loved Charlie Townsend, it had irked and bored her to submit to her husband's careless caresses. She wanted to have nothing more to do with him. She did not see how he could prove anything. If he accused her, she would deny, and if it came to pass that she could deny no longer, well, she would fling the truth in his teeth, and he could do what he chose. Yes, it's his fault that she's sleeping around. Surely. Surely it's his fault. VI, Chapter 6. Within 3 months of her marriage, she knew that she had made a mistake. Not 3 months before her marriage, 3 months after. But it had been her mother's fault. It is always the mother's fault. There was a photograph of her mother in the room, and Kitty's harassed eyes fell upon it. She did not know why she kept it there, for she was not very fond of her mother. There was one of her father too, but that was downstairs on the grand piano. It had been done when he took silk, and it represented him in a wig and gown. But I could not make him imposing. He was a little, wizened man with tired eyes and a long upper lip, with a thin mouth. A fictitious photographer had told him to look pleasant, but he had succeeded only in looking severe. It was on this account, for as a rule the down-turned corners of his mouth and the dejection of his eyes gave him an air of mild depression, that Mrs. Garnston, thinking it made him look judicial, had chosen it from among the proofs. But her own photograph showed her in the dress in which she had got to court when her husband was made King's Counsel. So that's what a CK is, a King's Counsel. She was very grand. She was very grand in the velvet ground. The long train so disposed as to show to advantage, with feathers in her hair and flowers in her hand. She held herself erect. She was a woman of 50, thin and flat-chested, with prominent cheekbones and a large, well-shaped nose. She had a grand quality of very smooth black hair, and Kitty had always suspected that it was not dyed. That, if not dyed, it was at least touched up. Her fine black eyes were never still, and this was the most noticeable thing about her, for when she was talking to you, it was disconcerting to see those restless eyes in that impassive, unlined and yellow face. They moved from one part of you to another, to one person in the room and then back to you, and you felt that she was criticizing you, summing you up, watching meanwhile of all that went on around her, and what the words she spoke, there had been no connection with her thoughts. Chapterino 7. Mrs. Garnston was a hard, cruel, managing, ambitious, parsimonious, and stupid woman. Parsimonious? Something? What is this? I probably should.
Parsimonious.
Unwilling to spend money or resources. Parsimonious. Okay. Ambitious, parsimonious, and stupid woman. She was the daughter of 5, of a solicitor in Liverpool, and Vernon Garston had met her when she was on the Northern Circuit. He had seemed that a young man of promise, and her father said he would go far. He hadn't. He was a painstaking, industrious, and capable, but he had not the will to advance himself. Mrs. Garnston despised him, but she recognized, through bitterness, that she could only achieve success through him, and she set herself to drive him on the way she desired to go. She nagged him without mercy. she discovered that if she wanted him to do something which sensitiveness revolted against, she had only to give him no peace, and eventually, exhausted, he would yield. On her side, she set herself to cultivate the people who might be useful. She flattered the solicitors who would send her husband briefs, and was familiar with their wives. She was obsequious. Oh. No, I don't know this one either.
Obsequious.
Obsequious. Obedient or attentive to an excessive or servile degree. Interesting.
Obsequious.
She was obsequious to the judges and their wives. She made much of promising politicians. In 25 years, Mrs. Garston never invited anyone to dine at her house because she liked him. That's the way to do it. She gave large dinner parties at regular intervals. Her parsimony was as strong in her as ambition. She hated to spend money. She flattered herself that she could make as much show as anyone else at half the price. Her dinners were long and elaborate, but thrifty, and she could never persuade herself that people, when they were eating and talking, knew what they drank. She wrapped sparkling Moselle in a napkin and thought her guests took it for champagne. Bernard Garstin had an affair, though not a large practice. Men who had been called after him had long outstripped him. Mrs. Garstin made him stand for Parliament. The exercise of the election was borne by the party, but here again her parsimony baked her ambition, and she could not bring herself to spend enough money to nurse the constituency. The subscriptions Bernard Garstin made to the innumerable funds a candidate is expected to contribute to were always just a little less than adequate. He was beaten. Though it would have pleased Mrs. Garstin to be a member's wife, she bore her disappointment with fortitude. The fact of her husband's standing had brought her in contact with a number of prominent persons, and she appreciated the addition to her social consequence. She knew that Bernard would never make his mark in the house. She wanted him to be a member only that he might have a claim on the gratitude of his party, and surely to fight 2 or 3 losing seats would give him that. But he was still a junior, and many younger men than he had already taken silk. Silky silk. Okay. It was necessary that he should too, not only because otherwise he could scarcely hope to be made a judge, but on her account also. It mortified her to go on into dinner after women 10 years younger than herself. But here she encountered in her husband an obstinacy which she had not for years been accustomed to. He was afraid that as KC, he would not get work. A bird in the hand was worth 2 in the brush, he told her, to which she retorted that a proverb was the last refuge of the mentally destitute. He suggested to her the possibility that his income would be halved, and that he knew that there was no argument which could have greater way with her. She would not listen. She called him pusillanimous. I'll have to look this one up as well. Showing lack of courage or determination.
Pusillanimous.
Pusillanimous. Ah, don't be such a pusillanimous. Well, there you go. That's probably where the first part comes from. Don't be such a pusillanimous. Who uses these words now? Be fun to see someone use them. She called him a pusillanimous. Like an animal. She gave him no peace, and at last, as always, he yielded. He applied for silk, and it was promptly awarded him. His misgivings were justified. He made no headway as a leader, and his briefs were very few. But he concealed any disappointment he may have felt, and if he reproached his wife, it was in his heart. He grew perhaps a little more silent, but he had always been silent at home, and no one in his family noticed a change in him. His daughters had never locked up him as anything but a source of income. Yes, sugar daddy, give us the money. It had always seemed perfectly natural that he should lead a dog's life in order to provide them with board and lodging, clothes, holiday, and money for odds and ends. And now, understanding that through his fault money was less plentiful, the indifference they felt for him was tinged with a exasperated contempt. It never occurred to them to ask themselves what were the feelings of this subdued little man, who went out early in the morning and came home at night only in time to dress for dinner. To dress for dinner. He was a stranger to them, but because he was their father, they took it for granted that he should show love and cherish them. Poor guy. Poor dude. Poor dude. That's her father. Okay, I want to see if I can hear that. Well, you guys could hear it, but I couldn't. I'm going to stop the stream now because it's about an hour of reading. And I'll restart OBS. Hopefully I'll get some sound. Because that way I'll have some sound in the game I'm going to be playing, etc. I'll be